Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Stacy, I'm a registered nurse. If you're new here, welcome in. If you're coming back, I'm so glad to have you. Let's talk about walking rounds. I've talked a lot about hospice because that's the area that I'm in, and this can work in a hospice facility or in a long-term care facility. I can't speak to a hospital because that's not where my experience is, but in a long-term skilled nursing facility situation or an inpatient unit in hospice, let's talk about walking rounds. And if you like what you see here, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. So when you come on shift or you're going off shift, what are the rules in the facility that you work in? Do they require that you give a certain amount of report? Do they have a requirement for walking rounds? I would say that best practice would be to walk into every patient's room and look at them. I don't think it's good to talk over your patient, to talk about them as if they're not in the room. Sometimes walking rounds, if you're talking and giving report and not acknowledging your patient, a patient can feel like you're talking about them, talking over them, or making them feel like they're less than. Our patients are sometimes alert and oriented and understand what you're saying, so never assume that they don't. And when they have dementia or memory loss or any of those things where their cognition is affected, we still want to be mindful of what we're saying about a person or talking about when we're giving cares, when we're doing rounds. I'll talk about this in another video too, but we'll talk about talking and communication when we're giving cares to our patients. But let's talk about walking rounds. If you want to give a report to a nurse that's coming on, it is really important to hit the high points and the changes that happen in your shift. Some nurses do not want to hear about everything on every patient. However, you can give them a rundown of what's critical and then say, hey, let's walk together and see the patients. This is critical. And I will tell you why. Because then you both have laid eyes on that patient together and you're accountable for that patient's well-being at the beginning and end of your shift. I have been in situations where a nurse did not look at a patient all shift, and you will walk in and find a horrific sight. Maybe someone's on the floor. I have found people deceased that someone told me was fine 10 minutes ago. It is really critical that you communicate to each other as nurses with respect. We all want to go home at the end of our shift, and we all want to get started when we come in, okay? We want to get our day started, most of us. You have those random outliers who are always chronically late. They're late coming in and they're late getting to give you report, okay? Some people they're just late, okay? And you can't control other people. But what is critical is that you give a good report and that you receive a report and that you walk down the hall and you do walking rounds. You want to walk in every patient's room, look at them. It's a good time to see, did the CNAs do their rounds? Are the patients clean? Is everything in order? Because then you have started your shift knowing what the status of each of your patients was. Especially if you work in long-term care, you want to look at everybody. You want to do walking rounds throughout your shift also. That's important. But at the beginning and the end of your shift, it is so crucial that you lay eyeballs on your patient and know what their status is and communicate with them. I don't know how it is in a hospital, but you need to say, hey, Miss Jones, I know you want your medication. We're going to give report and then I'll get started here and I'll come back to you here in about 10 minutes. Okay? You need to know what orders have changed, if anybody has had a change in condition, if any procedures are due to happen, if there's labs that need to be drawn. You need to know what happened while you were not at work, because people change every day and their status changes every day. And when we work in long-term care, it is especially on a long-term care side, sometimes things stay the same day after day after day after day, and you get into a routine. And so you miss it when something changes if you're not watching for it. So you should be vigilant and be watching for changes. In a skilled nursing setting, things are changing because in skilled nursing, on the skilled side of things, you're giving IV antibiotics, you're making sure that labs are being monitored for those IVs. Also in long-term care and in skilled nursing, you're checking PTINRs. You want to make sure that those were drawn. If you're coming in the evening, you want to make sure that you have an order for those. In the morning, that you are prepared that that patient needs to have a PT-INR and that you're watching for those labs to come in so that you can make sure that there's not a delay in a change for a treatment that needs to be done, for a medication that needs to be changed. It's really important when we are taking care of patients in a facility, even in an IPU setting, that we're looking at our patients, because especially in hospice, a person can die within 10 minutes of the last time that you looked at them. So maybe 10 minutes ago they truly were okay, but now they're gone. So it is just really critical, and I think it's really respectful as nurses to walk together, and it really doesn't take that long to do. I love talking to patients, so I'm a talker with my patients, and I promise you I won't get into that when you're giving me walking rounds. I'm honestly not in a facility anymore doing these things, but in a facility, I will tell you that CNAs will sometimes, if you did not do walking rounds and you do not know what a person looks like, then you cannot tell somebody that you saw. What if you didn't get to them for 2 hours and now they've been laying on the floor bleeding for 2 hours? Don't think that doesn't happen, that a person falls and breaks their head. Okay, it is really important that you laid eyes on them at the beginning of your shift when you took over. And it is really important when you're leaving the shift that you know that you laid eyes on them when you were leaving. It's important to be doing walking rounds throughout your shift. It's important to look and know where your patients are. You're responsible and accountable for those patients. You are taking on responsibility of those patients' well-being for the hours that you're on shift. And so it is really important that you understand where they are and what their status is generally. Obviously, we can't know. And sometimes even when you do walking rounds, maybe someone falls 5 minutes after you leave their room, okay? But at least you have a time frame of when you can say, this is the last time I saw them, this is the condition they were in. And CNAs will come to you if you didn't do walking rounds and say, hey, you know, Mary Jane was soaking wet from the top of her head to the bottom of her feet, and the pads were brown, and there's no way anybody changed her this entire shift. Okay, and this could be 2 hours into the shift to where they haven't done rounds either. Clearly, if a person's laying in a brown pad 2 hours into the shift. Okay, so you need to be able to know, was the person clean and dry? How was their well-being? Where were they? That's really why we do walking rounds. We want to be able to know that we actually saw that patient and knew what their status was. Because I'll tell you, I've had CNAs and I've done walking rounds and found patients that were dry. And if you come to me 4 hours into your shift as a CNA and you tell me that somebody is laying with brown rings around their pads, I'm going to ask you when the last time was that you laid eyes on your patient. Because if I did what I was supposed to do, I would know too, right? I'm going to tell you that when I was a CNA, I did do rounds every 2 hours. I did not skimp on those rounds. I worked on a hall alone. I worked night shifts, so that's what I did. I rounded, and then I got people up in the morning. And I was a pretty new CNA back when I was doing that sort of stuff. But I did rounds all night long. And if you came on shift, you were not going to find my people in a mess. Because you know what? I was not going to have Susan come to me at the beginning of my shift and say, you know, Stacy, you really left Mary Jane in a mess yesterday. No, no, no. So even as CNAs, it's important that you do walking rounds together so that you know what status your patient was if they were dry when you started your shift. Because if you don't do walking rounds together, and if I didn't do walking rounds, how do we know if they were like that at the beginning of the shift or if that happened during our shift? It's really important that you know the status of your patients. And it's really important that you try to keep to an every 2 rounds schedule at a minimum. At a minimum. If you have a patient who is having anxiety or agitation, they're on a new medication, if you administered pain medication, if you have a patient that has had a change in condition, you may be checking them more frequently than every 2 hours. If a person falls and hits their head, you're going to be doing neuro checks. You're going to be in there every 15 minutes for the first hour, every 30 minutes, 2 hours, every hour for so many hours, every 2 hours, every 4 hours, and then every shift for, I think it's 72 hours. You get to a point where you get to that every shift, and you're supposed to be checking, are they having any neurological changes? Because after somebody falls and hits their head, that first 24 hours is pretty critical. We know that, right? Things can change from the time they fell and hit their head within 15 minutes. Sometimes you fall and something is not hurt immediately, but it is developing an injury. And have you ever been in a car accident, or you've been hurt, you fell down and you felt fine when you first got up and your adrenaline was pumping, but then as the day went on, you had so much more pain and you found out maybe you broke something or maybe you twisted something and now you're hurting? It's the same with our patients. When they fall, they have some adrenaline going and they don't feel pain sometimes initially. I had a patient, I had been on shift for 12 hours. It was the end of my shift. I was about to give report, and I had just been at the desk for about 30 minutes from finishing my med pass. And the CNA walked by the room and said, "Hey, so-and-so is on the floor." And of course, that's what happens at the end of your shift, right? So-and-so ends up on the floor. And I'm going to tell you that I went to that room and so-and-so was bleeding on the floor. I went right to the room when the person told me that so-and-so was on the floor, because the patient was a critical patient. You know, I had just seen that patient 30 minutes prior. And I was livid when the CNA didn't say to me, "Hey, there's blood here too." There was blood on the floor. The patient was laying in blood. And it was not a good situation. I had to call for the crash cart, call for 911, perform CPR, have pressure held on this head wound that was bleeding. It was a mess. So walking rounds are critical at the beginning and the end of your shift, and also accurate description of what you see. Accurate description of what you see. So-and-so is on the floor and they have blood. Would have been nice. I mean, I went right down to that room and EMS was activated, because when you work in a long-term care facility, you know, these things happen and we have to call 911 because we're not an acute care facility and we can't do a CT of the head. We can't do stitches in a facility or staple someone up if they break open their head. Unfortunately, that happens in long-term care. And that is why it's important to be doing walking rounds, looking at your patients every couple of hours at a minimum. And if you know somebody's a faller, I don't know if you've had to do this in long-term care, but there were people that we had to put on 15-minute checks. Every 15 minutes, somebody needed to be walking by their room and saying, "Yes, I laid eyes on John. This is what he was doing. Yes, I laid eyes on John. This is what he was doing. Yes, I laid eyes on John. This is what he was doing." If you have somebody who is an elopement risk, a fall risk, and they're agitated and their medication has been titrated recently, sometimes you're going to be doing 15-minute checks. And even when you're doing those 15-minute checks, John might still fall on the floor and break his hip, because if he's determined to do so, he may still do it. But you need to be accountable for doing your rounds. It's really important. I don't mean to sound like I'm lecturing, though. I feel like I sound like I'm lecturing people sometimes when I'm giving education. I think I'm too stern sometimes. I guess it's because I've been in nursing for over 25 years and I've seen a lot. I've seen what happens when mistakes are made. And it's not mistakes that I've made, but mistakes that how many times have you been the nurse that you caught the mistake that the nurse made before you? How many times have you said, "Yeah, Jane, it's okay. I'll walk down the hall and look at people." Jane says, "Hey, I gotta go. I gotta go get my kid from school. I got to leave. I can't stay here any longer." "I'm sorry, Jane. We are gonna walk down this hall and look at these people. It takes 2 minutes to walk down this hall and look in and out of these rooms together. It doesn't take 2 minutes. It takes more like 10, okay? But if you're in a hurry to go get your kid, then maybe that's when you're doing walking report and walking rounds. Don't say anything that's going to violate HIPAA in the hallway, and don't say anything that's going to be demeaning to your patient or make them feel like you're talking bad about them or over them. Don't be disrespectful to your patients. But sometimes you do have to do a walking report. If Jane's got to go get her kid from school, then the first thing we're going to do is count that cart, and then we're going to do a walking report. Because you're not going to give me your keys without counting, and you're not going to leave this building until we've looked together to make sure all of these patients are okay, that I'm taking over. I'm taking over patients from you, and you're telling me that these patients are safe, and I want to make sure that that's true. So, have you ever had a time when you didn't do walking rounds and you ended up finding something critical later? Have you ever had a time when a coworker found something critical because they didn't do walking rounds and they can't remember the last time they laid eyes on a patient? How have you handled that? What did you do? I would love to hear about some things that happen in facilities where you've worked, how they were handled, and what kinds of things happened as a result. And if you like what you see here, then I ask that you like, subscribe, and follow for more. And I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.